Okay, now what we can do in the next few slides, it's just to see how to play, and also let's see how to model and what will be the strategy and the mechanism to model the situations we described so far. And in particular, we will use the two legal examples, so the Privacy Act and the license agreement that we saw before, and let's see how to model and will be the model in the logic. Okay, so let's start again with the Privacy Act. So we have sections 1, prohibitions to collect personal medical information. And for the sake of the discussion here, we have, let's say, a clear definition of what personal medical information is. Let's say it's a blood pressure, just for the sake of the example. And also we will have other conditions, which is about the personal information. For the sake of the example here, personal medical information and personal informations are different. So personal medical information, it's blood pressure, and personal information, it's the phone, your phone number. So those will be distinct and totally different. Now, for section 1, it says it's the prohibitions, and we have the offense. So we have something you should not do when you collect personal medical information. And essentially, we have a defense. In this case, as I told you before, the defense, it's a compensatory measure. And then essentially, if for some reasons there was a collection, an illegal collection of personal medical information, the way to recover from the situation is to destroy the illegally collected information without making use of it. So without examining or using for any other purposes, which is not destroying it. Now, then we have the section 2. Section 2 is an exception to section 1 because it specifies that, well, the collection of personal medical information is permitted, provided that you were authorized by a court order to collect it. Finally, section 3 is a prohibition, and then it says, well, you have the prohibitions to collect personal information unless it's forbidden to collect personal information unless you were permitted to collect personal medical information. So you were permitted to collect the other type of information. And then again, final 2 steps. It's just to make clear what it means. How can we model this? Well, the first step is to understand what are the key components. So, and to understand what the text means. So, first of all, sections 1 specifically say collection of medical information is forbidden. Then we have the sub-part of section 1 says, well, the extraction of illegal collected medical information excuses it's a compensation for the illegal collection. The collection of medical information is permitted if there is an authorizing court order. The next section 3 is collection of personal information is forbidden. We will have the exceptions to it. So the collection of personal information is permitted if the collection of medical information is permitted. So this is the next steps. Then what you do, the next step is just to provide some symbolic representation. So we can say, well, B, it just stands for these particular expressions, collection of medical information. C stands for the destruction of medical information. And then also we can specify this. And also for the relation of between B and C is that the C compensate for the legal collection. Then what we can specify that B, so the collection of medical information, it's permitted if A, so again, a new symbol, this particular condition here. And then we can go on. So D, it's forbidden, where D stands for collection of personal information. And again, we can establish the relationship between D and B. So D, it's permitted if B, it's permitted. So after we are able to identify what are the terms to use, and essentially to reuse the same term multiple times in the different expressions, in the different rules, we can identify whether some terms are obligatory, permitted, forbidden, and so on. We can try to identify what are the relationships between the different terms, or whether a particular term constitutes a compensation for another term, so the relation of another term, and so on. And then essentially we can build the logical structure. After we have this, then essentially we are ready for the final steps, which will be the formal representation. And then essentially what we can do, we can represent the combination of the first two conditions of this part here with a rule that say, well, by default, so I have no particular condition. I have the prohibition to collect medical information, but if I have a violation, so if I have the obligation and I do, if I have the obligation of not, so the prohibition and I do, then I have the obligation to destroy if I want to comply. Then I can go on and then to model the possible exceptions represented by section 3. If there is a court order, then remember that the defeater obligation corresponds to permissions to collect medical info. Then we can model section 3 by rule 3. By default, no particular condition, I have the prohibition obligation not to collect personal info. Finally, here we can see that we can use a permission, and then from the permission we have permitted to medical info, then obligatory as a defeater personal info, and finally we have the relationship between the different conditions. So in this situation here, what we have, then essentially if we have R2, if we have a court order, then this will allow you to derive that we are permitted to collect medical information. So since we will be able to derive the permitted medical information, then we can use R4 to defeat R3, and then we will able to get that we are permitted to collect personal information. Now, here, one of the things we have to be careful when we consider the example here, what about the situation where you illegally collect personal medical information and at the same time you collected personal information? So you collected the blood pressure and you collected the phone number. Then you realize that, well, you didn't have the court order to collect the medical information. You didn't have the authorization to collect the information about blood pressure. So you say, okay, now I want to comply, so I will destroy, I will remove this information. Are you still compliant, or you are in breach of this particular act, of this particular provision here? So in this situation, you comply with sections 1 because yes, you did the preparatory condition, so you destroy the legally collected information. However, even if you destroy, you were not permitted, even if you were able to collect and you don't, and the situation does not result in a violation, the condition do not entitle you to collect personal information simply because you didn't have the court order. So you were not permitted to collect the personal information. So in situations where at the same time you were collecting blood pressure, you were collecting also the phone number, and you destroy the information about blood pressure, you comply with section 1, but you are still in breach, you violate section 3, so you were not compliant. So here, doing the illegally step and compensated does not mean that you were permitted to do. Otherwise, the illegally collected would not make sense in this particular situation. So the collection was still illegal, but you were excused for it. And then it's why we can do this, and essentially, so you will not able to derive permitted medical info if you destroy. Now, this is it. reasonably important part, because if you just use, and this is do not have time, and I'm not going to the details here, but if you use more or less standard deontic logic or other deontic logic, you will have that in this situation, if you do the compensatory measures, you will still, well, most of the other logic will tell you that the collection of medical information was permitted, even if it wasn't. So you will get some wrong results. So I will publish the result and we have the full motivations, but it's a little bit too technical for today, and then I'm not going to into the further details. But be aware that if you use, let's say, formalism based on deontic logic using standard possible word semantic, which is commonly used, you will have this problem whenever there are some possible compensatory measures, because you will have that some illegal situations might be classified as permitted when they're still illegal. Okay, now let's go to the next example, and then let's see, and we can do the same exercise as before. Now here we have to do, there will be a couple of additional steps compared to what we have done before. And then let's see what are the aspects. So the first step is then, well, that the licensor grants a license, the licensee a license to evaluate the product. Then we already discussed section 2, so essentially section 2 says, well, you don't have to publish the result of the evaluations unless the publishing is approved before publishing by the licensors. And then in case you do, you have 24 hours to compensate and to remove it, and still to be compliant with the agreement. Then section 3, let's say, says that, well, it is forbidden to post on social media the evaluation of the product. However, you are permitted to do if you were permitted to publish the result of the evaluation. Section 4, it draws an additional conditions as well. If as a licensee you were conditioned to do an independent evaluations, then you have the obligations to publish the result of the evaluation. And finally, we have the termination condition in section 5. So for whatever reason you are in breach, then the agreement terminates. Again, let's see how to model and what are the conditions in this particular step here. Now, here, what we do and what we have to realize that, well, we have to have, there is a condition which is implicit in this statement here. So why do you need a license to evaluate a product if the use of the product is not forbidden? So in this particular situation, if you want to get the proper result, you have to understand that, well, it doesn't make sense to grant a license if to use a product, if the use of the product would not be forbidden otherwise. So here there is a condition, the condition C0, which is implicit, and then it's not explicit in the contract. But if you don't have it, then essentially you might get some wrong results. You might not get the exact condition, and then it's implicit in the specifications. Then we can go on. The baseline condition in C1, it's if a license is granted, then the use of product is permitted. We have in C2, the publication of the result, it's forbidden. In case you publish it, you have 24 hours to remove and it compensates the illegal publication. The publication, it's permitted if the publication was approved and the approval was before the publication. Posting on social social media, it's forbidden. However, you can post on social media if the publication was permitted. Now, then we can go for, I would say, the publication of the result, it's obligatory if you have a commission to do an independent evaluation. Here also we have another conditions well, we might have or we might not have. And then again, it might be implicit. So, well, if you have commissions to do an independent evaluation, then I would say you have the obligations to use the product. And that, again, it's implicit in the conditions. It's not explicit, but again, we want to make explicit, otherwise we will not be able to capture some particular aspects of the situation. And finally, it says we have to consider the termination condition. And then here, what we have to do, we have to understand what is the aim of the agreement. So the aim is to be able to use the product, and then essentially that is why the license is granted. So if we have an uncompensable violation, then we terminate the agreement, and then it means that the use of the product is forbidden in case we have a violation. Now, after we are able to do this analysis here, which you can get from the text, what we can do the modeling in the logic, and then what we can do is to get this final result. So what we have, it's the first step is to have, well, there is an obligation or prohibition to use the product, which is the condition 0. And remember, obligations not is a prohibition. Then you have, if you have a license, then you are permitted. So the feeder has obligations to use. Then we have a conditions that, well, if there is the prohibitions to publish the result, but then you can comply, you can recover if you remove it. You have the possible exceptions to the prohibition. So essentially, if you have an approval, then you are permitted to publish. However, there is the blank prohibitions to comment. Again, there will be the exceptions. If you are permitted to publish, then you are permitted to comment. Finally, if you have a conditions, then you have the obligations to publish. However, if you have the conditions, you have the obligations to use. Now, the final step is the termination. We use this symbol here to represent, well, we have an uncompensable violation. In case there is an uncompensable violation, then we have the prohibitions to use. And finally, we have to specify the superiority relation. So here we have to consider what are the possible conflicting rules, and then we use the principle that an exception overrides the baseline condition. So here we have R1 overrides R0, then R2E overrides R2, R3E, the exceptions for R3 overrides R3. And finally, the last one, it's R4X. So if you have the conditions override the not use, so essentially you got a license, you have the obligation of use. And also if you have the conditions, you have two obligations to publish. So R4 overrides R2, R4X overrides R0. Finally, you have to consider the termination. So all the use permitted to use, so R1, R4X are defeated by the violation. So if you have a violations, you terminate the other ones. And then essentially it's the full encoding. Then we can consider some possible situations. So what about if, let's say, you have a license, then if you have a license, then, and all you have is a license, then you get that you have the permissions to use and the prohibitions to publish and the prohibitions to comment. Then if you have a license and you get the approval to publish, then you have the permissions to publish. So you do not longer have the prohibition to publish. And then if you have the prohibitions to publish, then you have the permissions to publish here. So you have the trigger for R3E, and then this defeats the prohibitions to publish, to comment. Now, the other aspect is, well, what about if you were commissioned to do an independent evaluation, are you permitted to post on social media or not? In this particular situation, you have, well, if you have been commissioned, then you have the obligations to publish the result of the evaluation. But then we argue that if you have the obligations to publish, then, well, you should also permit it to publish. Otherwise, at the same time, you have an obligation and also you have the prohibition. So you are permitted to publish. So essentially, this will override this. Sorry, this one. And then, since you are now able that you are permitted to publish, then you can use R3E, the exceptions, to obtain that you were permitted to comment. Then the final step is, well, what about if you publish and remove? Still, if you publish and remove, you were not. If you have the provisions to publish, you publish and then you remove, you still are in breach of the obligation, but then you compensate, but then you don't have the permission to publish, and then finally you're not able to comment on social media. So if there were some posts in social media, then that will be a cause to terminate the contract. Okay, so that it's all I wanted to say, and just give me one moment, and the final step I just wanted to point out to one implementations we have, and then that it's possible to use. So let me just terminate the screen and then show another slide. Just give me 1 sec to get there. And so also to show some other small applications. Okay, so just what I want to show is a couple of applications we created in the past few years. So this is just an old implementation of the editor we have done. And essentially, well, the point is, well, what we do, we have a couple, we work on a couple of editors to facilitate the modeling of the rules. And then the important aspect essentially is that you can model a piece of legislation, and then what you can do, you can have side by side the textual provision and the corresponding in a more or less similar notation and the corresponding conditions. So as you can see here, you will have a text, and then you can see that there is a reasonably close correspondence between the text of the provisions and the logical representation. So here you can see that, well, you have particular obligations, and also you can specify particular different conditions. And again, you can do, and you can represent multiple of them. Now, if you are able to represent, then also you can look at some, you can provide the definition of the terms. So essentially you will have this, and then this could be helpful to understand what is the meaning. As far as the system is and any implementation is concerned, you will have to specify just some symbolic representation, but the important part is what is the meaning, and then essentially we want to be able as humans to understand what is the meaning of those particular expressions. And then in the implementation, then essentially what we can do, we can just take some Boolean, which will be some true or false expressions, but also we can extend, and then we can take some more, we can take some other different forms of terms. So we can specify that something will be some numeric, something it's a date, something it's a duration, and some other data types. So we can have a more rich, and then I'm going to show some of the example after. Now, after we have these, there will be some tools to show some visualizations. This could be useful for a legal drafter for example, to understand on one sense, on one side, what is the possible complexity of the representation. So here what we do is what we call the atom coincidence graph, and then essentially it means what is the relationship between the different terms and how the terms are related. And then this could be helpful for many possible applications. So what about if you're working on a draft of a piece of legislation, and then, well, you want to modify one particular term. So you want to modify, let's say, for this particular term here. So what are the terms which will be impacted by this modification or not? And then essentially this graph will give you this modification. Now also, this graph is quite useful to identify some other aspects. So why do we have this outlier? What is the meaning of this outlier? And then, well, there are two possible explanations. Either it's just a typo because it's something which is not used elsewhere. So for me, which is a typo machine, I use mostly to detect when I have some typos in my code. It could be a typo, or also it's, well, why do you have these particular terms in your legislations? Because it's totally disconnected from anything else, so it cannot be used to determine anything else. So why do you have it in your piece of legislation? And essentially it means this is something which is totally redundant. If it's not a typo, it's totally redundant. Also, you can use another representation, and then, well, this is very good if you are Italian and you like some good pasta dish. It's perfect for spaghetti. It's a nice spaghetti code. It's a nice spaghetti representation. And then here it displays so what is the possible depth of your rules, how many steps are needed to start from a particular atom, which must be given as a fact, and also what are the possible conclusions. Also, if you have this, you can dig down, you can consider also to see all the possible connections. Also, you can focus, and so you can just narrow down on particular element, and also you can use just a visual debug mode. So suppose that this is true, what does it follow from this one, and so on, and then essentially you can do some other checks in other aspects. Also, well, if you have this, you can have some analytics. For example, you can determine, you can have something like this. Essentially, well, you can determine, well, what are the final goals atoms? So essentially, what are the atoms that can be derived, and essentially they are not used to derive anything else. Also, what are the input atoms? So essentially, what are the atoms that must be defined, must be given as a possible fact of a case. Well, this could be helpful if you want to build an application where essentially you want to ask some questions about a possible scenario of a possible case. So essentially, you know that those will be what you have to ask, or subset of them to obtain a particular determination, and so on. And also, well, after you have, then essentially what you can do, you can just do, where was it? You can run, and then essentially you can get some snapshots. Okay, there are no snapshots there, but also you can do what we call some debugging, which is essentially, it could be, you can just add some particular atoms. Just let me add whatever, just, okay. So I have something these, those will be two possible facts. Then you can specify whether they are true or false. Just let's put true, and then you can execute. So essentially you determine what is this. And then based on this particular situation, then essentially what you can do, you will set it, you will get all the list of what are the obligation in force in this particular situation. So in that situation, this you have the obligation to check for this particular condition. You have to this other obligation, and so on. And then essentially it tells you what are all the obligation in force in a particular situation or not. So this is what be just a visual representation. The other part, it will be this engine. It's available. So if you want to take a note of this link here, so turnip box netlify.app, and then essentially here you can play. So here it's just to define a particular theory. So in the actual implementation, what you have to do for every term, you have to specify its data type. So an atom is a Boolean, which is something true or false. The specification just gives you the data type, the name of the atom, what is the symbols, plus what is the meaning in natural language. Also, you can have some numeric, so something which is just a number, it's an integer, or also or different type of numeric. And then essentially you can do different type of operations. In the left-hand side, you can specify Boolean, you can specify comparison operator, so something, a number, it's greater or equal or less, etc., and similar. In the right-hand side, and this is quite interesting, you can do some assignment. You can assign a value to a particular value, and so on. Also, you can have some strings, and then essentially here it's a perfect match for a string at this moment. Also, you can have multiple expressions. You can use conjunctions and disjunctions in the antecedent and conjunctions in the conclusions. You can specify that something is obligatory. Also, you can perform some computation on numeric and intervals, and then to get some durations and so on, and other aspects and so on. And essentially, you can play and you can create some theories and so on. Then you can specify a set of facts, and based on the set of facts, then essentially you can run and execute. And the theory will show everything that can be derived from a particular set of facts. So here we'll derive a set of obligations. Another part of, and here what we'll do, it's also another modality. Here for modality, we consider just obligation, permissions, prohibitions with F, and also we consider exempt. So what we do, we remove the negations from the operators, but otherwise it's fine. And also you can do some other operations. Okay, so that is all I wanted to say for today.